Look, I'm just going to come right out of the gate and say it. Rise of the Ronin is the most underrated and overhated game of the year so far. This game is great, and it's even better when you don't have a whiny baby screaming in your ear that it doesn't look like a next-gen game. But here's the thing. This is Team Ninja we're talking about, and they have always prioritized gameplay over graphics, so I don't get why it's all of a sudden a problem now for them. Team Ninja have always been one of the best action game studios, delivering some of the best combat systems I have ever seen, and Rise of the Ronin is no exception. Its combat is basically this perfect blend of Nioh with its in-depth stance system, and Wolong with its focus on parries and martial arts abilities. You add a grappling hook on top of that and a glider on top of that, and this blend has created quite possibly my favorite combat system that Team Ninja has ever done. Rise of the Ronin plays similar to Team Ninja's other Souls-like games, being the Nioh series and Wolong, but Rise of the Ronin is not a true Souls-like. In terms of overall design, it's actually most similar to the Assassin's Creed games or Ghost of Tsushima with Team Ninja's Souls-like style of combat. I know I mentioned Souls-like, and if you are worried about the difficulty of the game, there are actually 3 different difficulties. I played on the hardest difficulty with no NPC allies throughout the entirety of the game, and in terms of difficulty, I would say it's in between Wolong and Nioh 1 and 2. But it is a hard game on the hardest difficulty. But the most important thing is that the game is fair. It's not bullshit. If you mess up, it's your fault. Alongside all the difficulty options, there are also a metric fuck ton of accessibility options. You can reassign any button in the game, you can pause mid-combat, set aim assist for aiming ranged weapons, increase health recovery from heals, or decrease key loss if you're playing on the easiest difficulty. There are also a lot of great options for people like me with a deteriorated gamer brain, and that you can automatically pick up all items in the open world within a radius around you. So unlike a lot of other open world games, like Final Fantasy VII, you no longer need to go directly out of your way and interact with an item to loot something. All you need to do is run by it and it automatically gets picked up. You can also auto sell or auto dismantle certain weapons that fall under a certain tier, and since gold was pretty easy to get in this game, I turned on auto dismantle on and set it to the tier under the rarity I was usually getting at the time. The quality of life in this game is seriously amazing, and I don't think people give it enough credit, mainly because everyone's hating on the game. I've seen a lot of people dogging on this game, not only because of its graphics, but also because the open world is your standard Ubisoft open world. I know I complained about this type of open world in my last Final Fantasy VII video, even though I don't think it was bad, I just thought it was meh. But this is one of those exceptions where basically every single thing you do in this game, especially with those settings turned on, makes this world a breeze to go through. It also helps that this game seriously rewards you for exploring the world and doing all the side content. Every single thing that you do in this game gives you XP, and most of the objectives in the open world reward you with skill points that you can spend in the skill tree to unlock new abilities that completely change your playstyle in terms of combat. This made me have this carrot on a stick moment that I haven't really experienced in a game like this since Ghost of Tsushima a few years back. Speaking of Ghost of Tsushima, I keep seeing people saying this game is a ripoff of that, and why would you play this over Ghost? First of all, Ghost is an incredible game, and one that I do think overall has a better presentation than Rise of the Ronin. But at the same time, I think it's kind of dumb to completely write something off because it's somewhat similar and might not be as good as the project you're comparing it to. It's like saying, why play Elden Ring when you already have Bloodborne? Sorry, Elden Ring fans, but you get my point. Like, it's dumb. The style of games are on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, where Ghost goes for a much more realistic presentation, where one mistake from either side during combat can result in death. Meanwhile, Rise of Ronin got British dudes with rocket boots.
Japan will inevitably be lost.
Ghost does some things better, like the world story and graphics, but Rise of Ronin hard clears Ghost when it comes to combat, and I am not saying this to downplay Ghost of Tsushima combat, as it's great. But Rise of Ronin has something that Ghost of Tsushima does not, and that is the sauce. There is seriously something special about Rise of Ronin's combat that kind of reminds me of Lies of P last year, and that it takes what worked from previous games and sort of combines them together to create a fantastic combat system. Like I said earlier, it kind of just takes what worked with Nioh's stance system and Wolong's focus on parrying and martial arts and combined them together and added things like a grappling hook, pistols, a glider. There's a lot of options for taking out enemies in the game, and the best part is basically everything you do looks sick. If you want to go right in and slaughter everyone in sight, you can do that. If you want to stealthily approach and assassinate everyone, you can do that. And if you want to play the game basically like you're Batman, you can do that. The combat in this game is so much fun, and it just gets more and more in-depth as you unlock more weapons, stances, and especially skills. The skill tree is fairly large, and it's where you can get upgrades that have a lot of variety and seriously change up the flow of combat. You can spec in a better ranged weapon utility, you can get upgrades to swap the new weapons and stances mid-combo for higher damage output, and you can even upgrade the grappling hook to steal buffs and health items from enemies or throw items found in the open world at them. You can also put points into Speechcraft, where you can get new dialogue options that further increase bonds for some characters, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. Rise of the Ronin's combat has that special sauce, and anyone that says this game's combat is bad or has no depth either hasn't actually played the game or tried to play this like a Dark Souls game, which is basically the opposite of how you should play. You don't want to be patient and slow in this game, and instead you want to be fast and go big dick constantly while keeping an eye on that key gauge, because if that fully depletes you, you're probably fucked. I couldn't get enough of this game's combat system, and I was always going out of my way to fight any and all enemies in the open world, and I'm just blown away by some reviewers and people's takes that I've seen online that were saying that the game has no depth to its combat. It kind of reminds me of the people that see games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, or even recently Final Fantasy 16 and say that the games have no depth at all and all you do is press square. Like, what are we doing here? Now, when it comes to these type of games, there's always a focus on fun enemies and bosses, and Rise of the Ronin's variety in boss fights are pretty great. I was worried about enemy variety since the game is focused more on reality rather than having monsters and yokai like in Nioh or Wolong, but I never felt like the enemy variety was ever a problem since there are a ton of weapon types and a ton of stances, and any enemy can use any of them. There are also elites similar to what you find throughout other Souls-like games that are basically big, buffed up versions of the enemies that you normally fight, and these also have a bit of variety to them. You can fight 8-foot-tall dudes with claws, great swords, or adachis. You can fight Abe Lincoln with 2 hatchets. You can fight ninjas that utilize ninjutsu, wolves and boars that will fuck you up if you don't pay attention to them, or big-ass sumo dudes that abuse King and Tekken. The variety is pretty damn good despite being limited to just mainly using human enemy types. But one of my favorite aspects of Team Ninja games is obviously the boss fights, and especially the human boss fights. There's something about them where Team Ninja usually goes crazy with them, and oftentimes they're usually the best fights in their games, despite usually having a focus on monsters and yokai. Like Wolong, by far the best fight was Lu Bu. Nioh 2 had the William fight, which is incredible. It's just like, they go crazy with the human fights. Even though their normal boss fights are usually great, it's just the human fights go crazy. And this game, it's like that. Ah! Fucking shit on! Holy! I'm pretty sure I enjoyed basically every boss fight in the game. There was one 2v1 that happens kind of near the end of the game that I wasn't a big fan of. But other than that, I think every boss fight is like pretty solid to actually pretty great. First try. Another thing that was somewhat new to Team Ninja was having much more of a focus on the story and characters of the game. The story itself isn't great, but it is serviceable and far from being bad. The major characters are solid enough, with the best being Ryoma Sakamoto, who is your main companion throughout the game. Or at least he was in mine, since this game does have choices that you can make that change up the story and who you fight. I believe the game still follows history, so like depending on what side you choose, it's not going to be like different from how history worked. It's just going to be like the fights you get are going to be in different order. But I do believe the game sort of follows real life history, although obviously extremely exaggerated. This game also features a bond system for every character in the game, where you can further increase your bond with them to unlock new items, weapons, stances, and upgrades. You can increase your bond by giving them gifts, using them in missions, or completing their bond missions, which you unlock after every bond level up. I haven't done everyone, but I did do the ones for the major characters in the game, and they're actually pretty solid missions, like unique missions too, and some even have stories that are actually pretty good, especially Ryoma's. You fight a lot of people throughout history in this game, and sometimes multiple times, since everyone is backstabbing and betraying each other. And one thing that is kind of goofy about this is that if that person didn't die in history at that time, chances are the cutscene that plays after the fight will either have you recruit them or have them just run off. This can lead to some moments where you're having what seems like a fight to the death, and then you kill the boss and they're just like, holy shit, dude, that was the best fight of my life. We should be best friends. This happens a lot, especially with the foreigners in the game that backstab literally everyone and everything. So you'll fight like Jules Brunet or Rutherford Alcock multiple times just for them to be best buds with you after the fight. However, this can also lead to moments where you might fight a character and you think you're going to kill them just for them to leave, and then they just die off screen because they died how they did in real life. It's usually never super important characters, so it doesn't make the story worse. it can just throw you off when the characters mention their death since you never actually saw it. I wouldn't say this is something that hurt my enjoyment of the game's story, but I can see some people that are invested in the story or those characters being disappointed by it. Now, to get to the things that I wasn't a big fan of, I think the single biggest thing was the performance of this game. There are multiple quality settings in this game, and I played on performance mode, which for the most part played pretty well and held around 60 FPS, but there were times where it drops pretty hard at times. Thankfully, the parts where it drops like really hard, it's not important. It's usually like the pleasure district was like the biggest one, but there's like no combat that happens there. It's just in the it's just in like the major cities, so it wasn't too bad. There are definitely moments where the game drops in combat, but it never drops below 30, and like I said, it hovers around 60, so it feels good for like 95% of the game. It's nowhere as bad as that other game that released the same day as this one, Princess Peach Showtime. Now, Team Ninja has optimized their games after launch in the past, so I wouldn't be surprised if you see an update to fix these moments. In fact, I believe there was an update that came out today, and from what I'm reading, it seems like a lot of people are saying that it is better, although it could be just placebo. Who knows? Yeah, we won't know until somebody like Digital Foundry figures that out. So if poor performance is an issue for you, I would wait and see what they do with the game and then pick it up when they fix that. Now, another thing that I wasn't a big fan of is the length of the game. I think the game could have stopped at a really good point in Chapter 3, but it just kept going and going. And I feel like it kind of overstayed its welcome a little bit. It kind of does the same thing that Neo and Wolong do, where you fight like the same bosses near the end of the game, but they're like a souped up version of that boss. But I feel like in this game, because there's like a trillion characters, it kind of goes on a little too long, while I feel like it should have ended like 2 or 3 hours before the actual end of the game. And finally, this is more of a joke one, but the horse animation is so goofy. You get over it within like 10 minutes, but God, I don't know what they were cooking with this one. There's also a few moments of jank that I've had in the game. Like, I fell through the map once, but I did notice there is somewhat of an unstuck feature where when that happened, I just like 2 seconds later, I immediately went back to the top of the map. So it really wasn't too bad. Rise of the Ronin is a great game, and it's one that I feel like is getting unfairly cooked by people that have probably never played a Team Ninja game in their entire life. I feel like recently there's this fascination with graphics over gameplay, and that leads to some people on the internet losing their minds if a game doesn't look like a next-gen game. You see this with Rise of Ronin, and you just saw this recently earlier this year with the new Prince of Persia, which was fucking phenomenal and easily one of the best games to come out this year, and not really surprising, but it's also easily the best game Ubisoft has dropped in the past decade or two. There are a lot of games releasing around this time, so I understand if people don't want to drop $70 on a game that they may or may not like, and since it's not on Steam, you can't exactly refund it if you don't like it. But I would seriously keep an eye on this game and pick it up, as it's one of those games that I think a lot of people might not realize they would like, but after trying it out, they would fall in love with it. If you are a fan of Neo or Wolong, you will absolutely like this game. And if you're a fan of Assassin's Creed or Ghost of Tsushima, chances are it'll line up with your taste. Even if the story is just fine and the open world is your standard Ubisoft formula, I think the game's quality of life options make it a breeze to go through, and this game's combat is just so much fun, and it has that secret sauce that I think a lot of people, given they actually try to get into it, will end up really enjoying. Don't write off Rise of Ronin because the graphics aren't as good as other games, or because you think it's just like a certain other samurai game, because you will be sleeping on one of the most fun games to release this year so far.